This is Jay Watts from Merely Human Ministries. Welcome to episode 4 of season 2, if my math is correct, and it is. All right, we have, this is what I initially termed an Eric Carmen episode, all by myself, no interview today. We have 2 more coming up next week, but there was just some things we wanted to cover today, and we're going to do that a couple more times over the next at least once more over this season, because we're going to have a show completely and totally dedicated to really weird analogies that are made when we're arguing about the issue of abortion. That kind of flirted with that being the show today, but decided not to for reasons that have to do with one particular question. I wanted to talk about persons, but before we get to that, there's a couple of different things. Number one, if you are watching online, if you're watching on YouTube, then you see always the array of things behind me that I change out the, what are they? I can't remember what they're called. What are they called? Pops. Yeah, the pops that my family gives me. I changed them out. I think right now behind me, I have Saitama from One Punch Man. I have more cowbell. I know I also have Mr. Rogers back there. We have Darth Tater back there. I think he's over the shoulder. So there we go. There's Darth Tater, and there's a Daredevil potato head. There's Walking Jesus. That's right. That is from my wife. You wind him up and Jesus walks. There is a Kool-Aid that's there for my daughter, my youngest daughter, there's a period in her lacrosse career where she had a Kool-Aid sticker decal on her helmet, and so people called her Kool-Aid girl. So that's why Kool-Aid is there. And then right here, he is always back on the shelf, but today he is up here on the table with me. This is Sackboy. Sackboy comes from Little Big Planet. And the only reason I want to talk about this morning, because I was reflecting, it's a weird thing when you get older, right? I mean, I was just talking to one of my kids about this. As you get older and you're young, you're a teenager then, and all of a sudden you're in college, and your past is almost immediate to you, right? You feel like as you move away from your music or your shows or whatever, and they're just immediately lost, what it means to be sentimental or reminisce about them or to want them to come back is they're close to you. They're still relatively connected to the world around you in a meaningful way. There's a bridge that went from what you listen to what the people are currently listening to. So when you want to listen to that or hear that, it's not so distant. The past is immediate. And the older you get, though, the more those things change. And now at this point in my very early 50s, and I look back at my time growing up, it's weird because the world that I grew up in is entirely different than the world that my kids are growing up in every way. And so for my youngest at 14 now, her world doesn't in any way look like the world that I grew up with. And this came crashing down when somebody posted some things online recently. It was a little video that they had put together, and it was a bunch of items that I had grown up with. It was Simon. It was the game, there was all these different games, all these different ways of listening to music, all this thing that was our childhood. And my wife and I were looking at it, and I was thinking, man, that was such a particular time in our lives that's just gone. Right? It just will never come again. There will never be a group of people that grow up with the world that looked the way it looked when people my age grew up. That's true of every generation. Every generation has their own world that they're growing up in. But now that you're so distant from it, the reminiscing about it is for something gone, not something that is just immediately in our past that still has some logical connection to the world around you, but it's gone. And so as I think about that idea of my past and then grateful. And that's a weird thing to say, right? I guess because I'm grateful that I grew up in the time of boom boxes or Walkmans or any of the technology that we had. Even I remember when we got cable boxes. I remember when we got VCRs and we started being able to record. I remember recording songs on the radio, right? You would have your cassette player out and wait for the song to start, and then you record it. I remember when to get lyrics, you couldn't look up a a thing online. What you had to do was sit there and listen with a sheet of paper, like a legal pad or something like this, or your Trapper Keeper, or whatever you had. And you would sit there with a pen, and after you record the song, you'd go back and listen and write the lyrics out. And then you could go and compare what lyrics you had with somebody else to see if we were all matching up in case somebody got something weird. It was all of these different things that were tied to the technology of the era in which I grew up. I'm grateful for. It was a weird time. It was a strange time because it's so different than the world that we live in now, but it was our time, my wife's and I's time, anybody my age. And I'm grateful. And so I'm getting back to Sackboy. I was thinking about the world that my kids grew up in and the differences between it. And then in some ways I was grateful for little weird things in there. It's weird to say, but I'm grateful that my son and my daughter, who are a little bit older, and my first daughter, who are a little bit older than 4 years older than Nika and 5 years older than Nika. I'm grateful that we had the Wiggles when they were young. I don't know if you're familiar with the Wiggles, the Australian band, but man, we used to listen to the Wiggles when my kid was when Peyton was in his high chair.
Potato, hot potato, hot potato, hot potato, hot potato, hot potato, 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 potato.
And we would listen to the Wiggles, and he loved it. And there were Wiggles songs that we would sing as a family. And some of the TV shows, Bear in the Big Blue House. I'm grateful that my kid grew up in the time of Bear. I liked watching Bear in the Big Blue House with my kids. And so there's a lot of things that it's fun. Now, I am a little bit jealous because if you're growing up today, you have Bluey. And I think Bluey is probably, objectively speaking, the greatest TV show that kids have ever had. I mean, Bluey is awesome. But I am still grateful for things like Bear in the Big Blue House, for the Wiggles, for this time period that my kids grew up in where we had these very specific things that were their time. And one of the things is, I was just thinking recently about how grateful I was that I played Little Big Planet with my kids as a video game that we played together and worked our way through. Here's a storyline. If you're not familiar with Little Big Planet, that's where Sackboy comes from. Sackboy starts like this. He looks like this. If you're listening, he's just very basic. It looks like he's made out of canvas. He has a zipper on them. And then as you progress through the game, you find accessories to add to him so you can individualize it. Little Big Planet also offer the opportunity for you to go online and design your own worlds based on the way that the design parameters put into Little Big Planet. So you could build the Little Big Planet universe and then share your level or stage with somebody else. And that would become part of this greater Little Big Planet world that you could experience that was being built by everybody that was playing it. So you had the main goal, the main game, and then you had the ability to create more. Now, when I say I'm happy, I was talking to my son yesterday and I said, I don't ever remember in my entire life playing a video game that I felt as satisfied with at the ending as I did Little Big Planet. Little Big Planet is a strange little game where you are running around trying to find basically lost friends or have been taken, and there are nefarious forces working there. But it's all very fun, and it's got really good music. And by the time you get to the end, and I feel like it's okay to spoil it now because it's so by the time you get to the end, you find the person that's been stealing all of your friends and everybody. And in the confrontation with them at the ending of it, you find out that he just wants to play. And so we all agree to play with each other. And then everybody gets free and there's a party and it's all very happy. And I was telling my son, I don't ever remember being that satisfied with the ending because it felt weird as you were developing towards the big bad, right? The big boss that you had to fight at the very end, that you had to overcome, because Little Big Planet was such a kind and happy game. It felt weird that we were coming to this confrontation, this point of defeating this enemy. And so I cannot express, for whatever reason, how satisfying it was as an adult playing this game with your kids, that at the very end, the result was, we all just want to play together. So let's just play and have fun and not be more intense than we have to be. It was such a lovely ending to a lovely game. And I'm grateful. So that's why I have Sackboy here with me all of the time, is because Sackboy is a reminder, not just of a really great time I had with my kids, which it was, but also a reminder of kindness and fun and being playful and creativity and a lot of things that are just great about being young and about being alive in general and about being a child of God or however you want to put it, about the image bearer of God, to be that sort of thing and to have at our ability the resources to be creative and to be loving and to be kind. And I love when that's, if you go back to Free Guy right now, is probably one of my favorite movies to go back and watch every once in a while, because I think Free Guy has such a great message tied to the gaming world that can be cynical and it can be obscene and it can be corrosive and all of these things that the gaming world can be. And this movie centers around this idea that if we gave gamers the opportunity to just experience watching these life forms grow and be happy and flourish and thrive and enjoy themselves, that maybe there would be something there. And Guy, very much like Buddy the Elf, if you're watching the movie Elf, is an unapologetically, unrelentingly positive person, the character Guy in the movie. And that's a lovely thing in a movie as well. And going back to what I think is probably the best treatment of kindness in a film that I've seen that resonates with me. I'm obviously, I may be forgetting something, but the live action Cinderella, directed by Kenneth Branagh, to me, maybe the only single live action Disney movie that they've come out with since they started this atrocity of taking all of these great animated movies and turning them into mediocre or horrible live action movies and it's such a cynical cash grab. I mean, they're not even apologizing for it. They've made terrible decisions with their IP. They bought all of this stuff rather than creating new things. And then they're running it all into the ground and they're just doing a terrible job and they're losing billions. They're spending billions of dollars to make money or to make products that people don't enjoy and don't like watching. And it's so they are doing things, but they're saying, we're doing this only to make money. We're making another Toy Story movie because we need the money. We're making another Frozen movie because we need the money. We're making all of these animated movies into live action movies because we need the money. We're jacking up the prices on our resorts and everything else because we need the money, because we've mismanaged one of the largest companies in the world. So here's the problem though. Almost every live action remake they made is garbage. And there's no point in having made it, except I will argue the Cinderella remake. Because what Cinderella, and I was just talking to my wife about Cinderella anyway. Cinderella is a strange story for me in the sense that at any given moment, if you ask me if I'm in love with the story of Cinderella, I would tell you no. And I don't even think there's that much depth there. I don't think there's much to plumb there. But every time I watch the animated movie with my kids, and that happened a lot growing up because my daughters loved the Cinderella movie, the animated movie, I liked it. Every time I watched it, I was surprised to find out how much I enjoyed the movie and how much I thought there was there that I really liked. So when they decided, but I don't like all the Cinderella, the a million other Cinderella stories I could live without. It felt like they're making them constantly. So when they announced they were making this live action movie, at first I thought I was dismissive of the idea. There's nothing more to do. It's been done well the first time. Leave it alone and stop retelling it because that animated movie works. And then I went and saw it and completely changed my mind. Not only do I think it's well acted. I mean, they have some great actors in that movie, but it's a treatment of the power of kindness. I mean, that's what the movie is. The movie is a reflection on the power of kindness, of just unrelenting kindness, of a character who makes it her goal, because this was passed to her from her parents whom she loved, who were both kind people, that in order to honor them in the way that she lives her life, she is going to be kind to everyone as much as she can. She will return indifference with kindness, anger with kindness. She's going to try her best throughout her life to give that to her world. The refrain throughout is to have courage and be kind. Is the way that she lives her life, the mantra by which she lives her life, the principles, the guiding principles of her life, to have courage and be kind. If you have courage and you're kind, it's going to work out. You'll be able to sort things through. And it's a beautiful treatment to me of how powerful that idea is, especially in a world where everyone else around, except for a few very specific characters, is looking out for themselves, looking for their own advancement, looking for the growth of their own power, manipulating, being hurtful, hateful, and in some places just flat out evil. And just constant return in the face of that, of the kindness of Cinderella, building towards a very Christian moment where I think you also get a great treatment of the power of forgiveness. As Christians, we're called to forgive. And sometimes it can seem like an odd command for God to say to forgive others. And at the end of that movie, you get to see as she forgives her stepmother for everything that she's done to her, that the forgiveness is working both as a weapon against the evil of the stepmother, but also empowers her to move on in her life and to no longer allow the stepmother's evil, hatred, all the things that she's done to her, abuse, no longer allow that to define who she is. It's just a wonderful treatment of kindness. And so on the same level, Little Big Planet for me was that as a video game as well. It was this fun and yet not dark, and it was upbeat, and it was positive, and it was filled with happiness, and there was nothing that was, I do remember there is one stage that takes place in something like a haunted house, and my youngest did not particularly enjoy that stage. So whenever we were there, she would leave the room. But other than that, it was just such a wonderful thing. And so that's what I have Sackboy with me all the time when I am here doing this in the studio doing this, because Sackboy reminds me both of a really fun time that I had with my kids and also the imperative to not see conflict for the point of defeating the people who I'm up against as the resolution that I'm seeking. That sometimes we're trying to, all the time, we're trying to bring a community together through searching for truth, right? Truth is good. True things, understanding the world as it is, a true understanding of what it is good for all of us. And if I can convince you of the truth, particularly what we talk about a lot on this show, that all human beings ought to be treated with dignity and respect, that the world will be a better place. And that fighting over that with the people that you have to argue with this shouldn't be something ugly. Okay, and to that point, we're going to get to something a little later. There's one other thing I want to talk to you before we get to that, though. So before we get to the Roland Martin video, there's one other thing that I do want to talk about, and that is, and this is purely Jay, churchgoer, Christian guy, moment about reflection on this weekend. At our church, we did the Lord's Supper this weekend. What I'm about to say is not meant to be an admonition or a complaint about my church, although there probably is on some level or another. There's some judgment in there that can't be avoided about the way things happened this weekend. Here's the thing, and here's where I come from with this. This is not a question of what I think the Lord's Supper is. So I'm not getting into this between like Catholic or Protestant views of the Lord's Supper. I'm not like transubstantiation or whether it's spiritually infused or whether it's merely symbolic. I don't want to get into any of this because no matter what your view of the Lord's Supper is as a Christian, there's one thing that's undeniable. It's important. It's a deeply important thing, right? Everyone, no matter how we view it, as we come to the Lord's Supper, has to come with that view in mind. And I'm oftentimes, I guess I just a little bit taken aback at how unreflective we can be at what a relationship with God entails. For those of us who believe in God, if you don't believe in God, obviously there's absurdities to all of this that we would have to work through in a different argument for you, from your idea of it. But if you do, from a purely theistic point of view, or from a particularly Christian point of view, let's talk about what it is that we're discussing. In relationship with God, we're talking about a relationship with an all-powerful, transcendent being. Yes, he is mercy and grace and love. He is all of those things when you talk about it, Jesus manifesting those things for us in the incarnation. But he is also judgment. He is also justice. He is also the God that sustains the universe every single moment. He is jealous and he is forgiving. This is by any evaluation, the concept of God we're talking about ought to, on some level, be terrifying. In the sense that the Bible tells us that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. You go to him first, recognizing that the entity that I approach is something I cannot understand, operating at a power level that is inconceivable to me. And I have been given to understand through both his revealed word and the teachings of the people that have taught me this, that he cares about me as an individual. And that in and of itself is terrifying because I am all sorts of messed up. And the idea that he is watching, knowledgeable, I mean, not watching in the same way we watch in that sense of like eyes on you, like staring at you, but he is aware constantly. I remember asking a guy many years ago who was struggling with his faith, and he and I were chatting, and he was prone to do things. And so he would tell me conversationally things that he wasn't proud of. And one time I asked him, I said, "So you believe in God?" He said, "Yes." And I said, "So do me answer this question. When you go into those rooms and do the things that you do, where do you think he is then?" And I remember him looking horrified as I asked the question. And then he said, "I guess somewhere in my mind, in my heart, I hoped that he just stayed out of the room, that he wasn't watching." So, but as I say that, I think I believe in God and I know the things that I'm doing. And I know he knows the things that I'm doing. And the relationship with him requires so many times that we rationalize or justify different things, excuses that we make for what we're doing. This gets all obviously much bigger the more egregious the sin that we're talking about. But even at lower levels, we have to be mindful of the idea that God's perfection is terrifying. I remember one time I was working with some young people. There's 3 of them. And they were trying to do some discipling thing with me. And we were sitting around talking. And one of them was sharing with me the experience of another mentor. He said, "Oh, this mentor is a holy man. This mentor is a holy man." And I'm thinking, the term holiness is a very powerful word for me. So what do you mean? He said, "Oh, he and I were talking." And he said, "One time I managed to go 3 days without sinning. That's the longest I've ever gone. 3 days without sin." And he seemed taken aback that I seemed incredulous about this claim. And he said, what do you doubt that my mentor went 3 days without sin, that this holy man was able to live 3 days? And I have no doubt that your mentor believes that. Sure. Right. But when you say without sin, when you say the holiness of God, and then you say for 3 days you managed to live like that, to me, you don't understand what we mean when we say the holiness of God, of such quality that if you looked at it and beheld it in person, it would destroy you. It would annihilate you. So no, I don't think your mentor did that for 3 days. Now, I believe that he did his best and maybe had 3 really strong days. But the holiness of God is terrifying in its purity, and it's inconceivable to us. And we can, empowered by God, do the best that we can. But there will always be sins of omission. There will always be things that we should have done that we didn't do, because we're not perfect in our knowledge or understanding of the world around us and the needs of the people and even of the perfect will of God. These are things that will always evade us. We are empowered through the Holy Spirit to live and to seek the truth, but we are held back by certain weaknesses that we have and not being God. And so I'm not saying that he didn't have 3 great days where, to the best of his knowledge, he did the best that he absolutely could. I'm saying that the gap between the perfect holiness of God and what we are at any given moment is well, it's impossible for us to grasp. because we can't even behold the holiness of God except through his son, Jesus. So here's the thing. When we take the blood of the body, however we understand this, we are given some warnings. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, we'll start in verse 23. For I received from the Lord, Paul writes, what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and he was given thanks, and he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me, my body, my blood. Then he says, and then Paul writes, for whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Okay, this is not a trivial thing. And then he goes on to say, so then, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. Everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For those who eat and drink without discerning the body of Christ eat and drink judgment on themselves. So, flashback to this weekend. We're at church and our church is doing the Lord's Supper. And because we had a dog that was injured and there'd been all these things that were going on, my wife had to stay home. And so I was there alone with my youngest, with Nika. And she and I are watching, and we get to the Lord's Supper and they tell us that we're going to take it. And they mention some words about what it is, but no warning, no serious moment of get right. You're about to take the Lord's Supper. You're about to drink the blood and eat the body. You're about to remember the price that was paid for your sin. You're about to embrace it, and you're to take it in you to demonstrate your awareness of who we are and what our relationship is to him and all of this. And without that seriousness, I felt a moment I stopped. Like as they're passing around, I stopped. And I looked at my 14-year-old and I said, I need to know that you know that if you have something you're carrying in your heart before we do this, that you now have the opportunity to give it up to God. If something that you're living with, that you need to reconcile yourself to God. If there is someone who you are in an argument with that you are not at peace with right now, then you need to recognize that before God and actually go fix it if at all possible, or at least as much as it is on your part. There are people who hate me, a lot of people who hate me. There are Christians who hate me. There are people that used to be my friends who hate me. And when they tell me that, I remember one particular painful conversation when a friend was telling me how much he hates me. I was trying to make sure that I didn't allow that to come to me. Going back to even to some of the kindness we were talking about earlier. And I was telling them, I understand why you feel the things that you feel, but it will not ever be returned. I will never do anything but love you. That is all I have. And I understand why you don't like me, but I'm asking you to forgive me if you feel like I have wronged you, if I have wronged you, if you see this as wrong, or if this thing that I've done, I apologize for at this point, so that we can be reconciled with each other. If we have to part, let us part, but let's not part like this. Let's do whatever we have to do here on both of our parts, on both of our sides, to make sure that we part as people that recognize the value of each other, the love of God that governs our lives. You don't have to like me. I can live with that. But we can't actively hate each other. We're just not allowed. We just don't have that opportunity or option given to us. And I have to go before. I was talking to a man who was a very powerful player many, many years ago in the apologetics community. And he was telling me, over dinner one time, he said, I was a pastor at a church. And I suddenly found out that two families, I said, what's going on between those families over there? There seems to be some tension. And the deacons that I was eating with were telling me, oh, they hate each other. And they've hated each other for years. And he said, why am I only hearing about this now? And I said, well, we just didn't think it was that important as a new pastor if we didn't know about it. He said, no, you don't understand. Since I've been pastor, we've taken the Lord's Supper multiple times. And we have people in our congregation who hate each other. I have to know, I can't let them take the Lord's Supper under those conditions. They have to reconcile this in some way before we go to God. And the answer from that church was to fire the pastor for making those demands on them to take the Lord's Supper seriously. So that moment I looked at my daughter and I said, this is a serious thing. We have to do everything that we can at this moment to be right with God as we take the body and the blood. Are you ready? And she said, yes. I said, okay. Because I was concerned with the cavalier nature. One more story on this before we move on. Many years ago, I was working with a youth group, a Disciple Now. So I was a D Now, Southern Baptist Church, and they were getting ready to take the Lord's Supper. And I wasn't enjoying it. I mean, in the sense of I enjoy youth. I enjoy working with youth. That's not the problem. It's the show wears on me sometimes. The show is just not my thing. I'm not part of the show. And so the show was wearing on me, and I was sitting back there, and all of a sudden this young man, early high school, gets up, runs out the back crying. His student leader, college guy, runs out the back chasing after him. The youth minister looks at me and he said, I can't leave. I don't know what's going on out there, but I don't trust that college guy to handle it perfectly. So would you go out and just watch what happens? And I said, okay, I got you. So I walked outside. We're in this hallway and there's this young man crying. And there's this college guy who his heart's in the right place. It really is. I understand where he's coming from. He's trying to make sense of what's happening there. He's young. He's impulsive. He's passionate. That's why he's volunteering at this thing. He wants to serve God. He wants to do the right thing. And he's telling this kid, I understand why you're upset. I understand what you're doing. You understand all the terrible things that I did before I came to know Christ in college. And then he starts listing off all the terrible things he did when he was in college to this poor kid who was already burdened with something else. And now he's dumping all of his stuff on him. And I'm watching this thinking, whoa, no. So, after he lists off this completely inappropriate list, he's trying to identify with the kid. Whatever this kid is going through, he thinks if he lets this kid know that he's a sinner too, it's going to help him come to terms with all that. And so when he got done with this list and the kid just was sitting there, the young man was sitting there, I sat down next to the young man and I said, hey, and we don't know each other. So, but can I ask you something? And he said, yes. I said, what are you upset about? What is it that you're so upset about right now? What drove you from that room crying? And he said, I'm not a Christian, but I've learned so much from the teaching over the last few days. And then they said they were going to take the Lord's Supper. That we have the opportunity now, if we want to pray. And he said, I can't take it. You don't know the things I've done. I cannot go up there and do this now. I'm not worthy to take it. And I looked at that kid for a second and I thought, and I said to him, young man, you may be the only person in that room that's ready to take the Lord's Supper. You may be the only person in this building that has grasped some way through all of this, the spiritual importance about what's about to happen in that room. I can't think of a single other person that's ready to take the Lord's Supper more than you right now. As a matter of fact, I feel condemned as I'm talking to you that I didn't prepare myself enough for this moment today, knowing that it was coming. Said, I am unworthy of the Lord's Supper. You are unworthy. You are right. So let's pray here together if you want to. And then you and me, you and I will walk down that aisle and we will take the Lord's Supper together. Two unworthy human beings, two brothers in Christ, if we pray together now, taking the Lord's Supper as it ought to have been taken, with fear, but at the same time, recognition of what that means that we take the body and the blood, that all those things that we're ashamed of that we're bringing to the altar of God have been taken care of through the cross and the resurrection. So, young man, you're ready as long as you're willing to take the forgiveness, as long as you're willing to take the grace that's clearly being laid out in front of you right now, the call to repentance that we will answer through prayer and the approach to the altar to take the Lord's Supper. It is such a powerful moment. And we take it for granted. I don't think we mean to. It's just part of the order of worship or things that we have to do. But that moment of panic when I looked at my daughter, not panic in the sense of, oh no, this is awful, but the seriousness with which I needed her to understand, they're going to give you a little cup, like a little shot glass, and they're going to give you a little piece of bread or a little piece of unleavened bread. And they're going to pass that on to you as if it were just the easiest thing in the world to take it and to drink it and to eat it and to move on with your life. And I got to tell you, it's not. So let's take this moment seriously between the two of us, even if it may not be taken seriously enough in this moment, in my estimation. But so I wanted to talk about that a little bit as well too. Now let's move on. We've done Sackboy, kindness, the Lord's Supper. Now I want to play, this was a video that we're going to play from YouTube that it came across the night before we do these podcasts. I get asked, do you have any assets that you would like us to have? Videos, audio, anything that they want us to show? And I almost always say no. And if I ever do, I almost do it like this, where I walk into the studio and I say, JD, can we do this? This just came up. So I know I was supposed to give it to you last night, but here it is. But this came up and I just wanted to respond briefly to this. This is Roland Martin, Democrat. He has a podcast. He does interviews. And in this particular case, it's an argument that he's having with a black woman who is pro-life, who is talking to him about abortion. And are we ready to go ahead and show it? We'll let it speak for itself so you can listen to it now. And if you're watching it, it should be here.
When we talk about aborting babies, like, so you're saying to me that because we support life, actually giving babies the opportunity to live, I'm confused.
Baby born.
I'm so confused.
No. First of all, hold up. You're confused because you think I'm saying something that I'm not.
Well, tell me what you're saying.
What I'm telling you, I'm being very clear. You cannot say you are pro-life when you vote against prenatal care for the mother. You cannot say you are pro-life when you vote against Head Start. Right. You cannot say you are pro-life when you do not want to expand Medicaid to keep hospitals open. You cannot say you are pro-life when you have OBGYNs who are not available in your state. You cannot say you are pro-life when you have black women who are dying at a higher rate during childbirth and you do nothing public policy-wise to fix it. You cannot say you are pro-life if you allow infant mortality rates to be sky high in areas where there are black and brown people. What that tells me is you are anti-abortion. You are not pro-life. Right. Because if you are pro-life, you care about the child in the womb and when the child is out. And if you are pro-life, you are standing there with black folks when their kids are killed by cops. You are not silent. So if you're pro-life, be pro-life from the womb to the tomb, but not just in the womb.
There was a lot to sort through. And so I want to avoid trying to go through item by item and pick at every little thing that's said in there, just because of interest in time, we don't have it. And I just don't have the interest in sorting through all of it. But I want to say there's a couple of things I did not like about that exchange. Number one, I have tried my hardest to teach my kids that adults yelling at each other should not be normal for communication. The world has tried its best to teach different lessons, particularly on talk shows. Look, I have lived my entire life as an adult, and I can tell you the number of times that I was yelled at by another adult, and they're shockingly small. It just doesn't happen. Other adults just don't yell at me during the course of a conversation and start screaming at me. And if they did, the few times that it has happened, I've shut down the conversation. That's not a normal way to talk to people, and it's unhealthy. And my son and my daughters have had to work with people in their youth that are probably more likely. Now, this is not talking about coaches yelling. Like coaches, when you're on a sports team, they can be loud. This is talking about yelling at somebody in a discussion. Okay, so I'm not in love with the tone, but that's tone police is something that I hear about that people don't like online. When you're arguing about the tone, who are you to tell them about the tone? That's fine. Okay. So the idea is if I am going to call myself pro-life, then I am required to take on every other position that's held by Roland Martin that he believes is indicative of respect for other human life. If not, then I'm not allowed to call myself pro-life. So there's so many things wrong with this. First of all, if I'm talking about the identity and definition of pro-life as somebody who believes that all human beings ought to be treated with dignity and respect in the sense of what Christopher Kaiser is often called the inclusive view of human value, that every human being ought to be treated, every member of the human family ought to be treated with dignity and respect. All those who are identified as humans fall into the category as valuable members of our human family. And so if you're a human, you are one of us, and I must proceed accordingly. So if that's true, then the statement that this woman was making in this conversation was, you're mad at us because we want to protect life before it's born from the destructive act of abortion because we have an inclusive view of human life. And we believe that human life ought to be treated with dignity and respect, even at its immature, early stages. That's why we're called pro-life. And he says, you don't get to be pro-life. Now, here's the only reason that I'm responding to this, because I don't think that there's anything substantively to respond. First of all, it's not an argument. It's a rant. It's an aggressive rant. It's question begging throughout the whole thing, because the purpose of me, for example, if you follow this podcast, if you go to our website, if you've seen the articles or any of the podcasts that I've done with places like Christian Research Journal or Postmodern Realities, then you know that we focus on things other than just the issue of abortion, but that we focus more on abortion than anything else. Why? Because I don't know anything else that's killing that many human lives every year. I just don't. There's a reason that abortion has a higher level of urgency than other things. It's a destructive act against human life where somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1 million lives are lost every year in the United States. It used to be reliably about 1.3 million human lives destroyed through abortion every year. I think at its peak is almost like 1.7 to something. And then we've come down to somewhere around 1 million. It's hard to keep track of now because of chemical abortions, and the pill has now moved to well over 50% of abortions. The majority of abortions are now going to be done through chemical abortions and through RU486 through medical abortion. And so this is why we have urgency on this issue, because it's human life being destroyed in every single act of abortion. This is inarguable, by the way. This is inarguable. There is no way to describe abortion without the intentional destruction of an innocent human life. Now, you may parse through the word innocent and say, well, that confers on some level of it a personhood. We're going to get into that in a second. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But that's why there's a priority and an urgency given to this issue over others. The other thing is, in order for us to end abortion, we just need to convince people to stop aborting their kids. Now, they're going to say, oh, well, I do it. Somebody's always going to do it. You're never going to end it. But that's true of all sorts of different things. And by the way, at the end of that, he says, you're not pro-life or anti-abortion. Well, that's just because you defined pro-life under certain terms. Let me be very clear. I don't have any problem with the anti-abortion title at all. You can call me anti-abortion. It doesn't break my heart. It doesn't hurt my feelings. It doesn't make me sad. And I don't shy away from it. I am anti-abortion. I'm anti-rape. I'm anti-slavery. I'm anti-murder. I'm anti-theft. I'm anti all sorts of things. You can add abortion to that list as well, and it doesn't hurt my feelings at all. But what I don't like is the idea that, and they call it, I think this was titled like exposing the hypocrisy of the pro-life movement. First of all, we are recording this in the building of the local pregnancy resource center. because they say you only care about it until it's born. At this pregnancy center, I know we go up to 2T. Don't we go to 4T? Or we're trying to at some point. So 2T clothing, up to 3T. Okay, up to 3T. Up to 3T in clothing, diapers, all the needs we can possibly give. And we make them available to people if they come and participate with certain programs, as many free of charge. Free of charge. All of those, by the way, are donated by the people in this community, the anti-abortion people in this community that are accused of not caring about children after they're born. See, here's the problem with the list that we were given by Roland Martin as far as what defines you as not caring about life. It's not that you don't care, and it's not that you don't do things. It's that you don't do things, as he says himself, through public policy. Now, it has been accepted all throughout my childhood that most people in politics had similar goals, but had different means of reaching them. Meaning we wanted the same things. We wanted to see the same results. We just didn't believe that what you were going to do works. Now let's take Head Start for a second, because he mentions Head Start in there. If you don't want to fund Head Start, okay. So this is a good example, I think, to get some understanding of the difference between being somebody who believes that all human beings ought to be treated with dignity and respect, but not believing that a certain way of doing things will be ultimately beneficial to the society at large. Because what he's saying is, if you don't support Head Start, then you don't care about kids who are underperforming because they're living in impoverished communities and don't have the same resources available that other people do. But that's not the same. And I'm not saying I don't support Head Start or I do support Head Start. I'm not taking a side on this at all. I just want to discuss this as an issue for a moment. It's possible that someone has the same desire to see the same people that Head Start, the same communities that Head Start is aimed and created to help and is aimed at. We want to see them flourish. We want to see them do well. We want to find ways to lift them out of the life that they are living, that we see the same unfairness. There are places that are just, it's not fair for a kid to grow up. I was speaking one time at an inner city school. I would go and speak. When I would go to speak places, they'll sometimes will find places for me to go to speak for free in the area. And they asked if I would come speak to these very young children at an inner city school. And I was there talking to them, and it was interesting. It was in the sense that it was the communication and the Q&A. There was a lot of questions about how life works and as far as how the lifestyle, and they were trying to understand who I was and the world that I came from and what was standing in front of them right now, because I was foreign to them. It was alien to the world that they lived in. But then when I was leaving, there was on the wall, there was written projects all along the wall in the hallway. What do you love best about your community? And what do you dislike about your community? And it was sad, because almost every child had written the same things that they disliked about their community. They didn't like the trash. They didn't like just how much trash there was everywhere in their community. They didn't like fighting around them all the time. They didn't feel safe in their community. If you read those items on that wall, then you know that there are kids that are growing up that are just living in a different world than the kids who are living in my house grew up in. They don't have the same ability to focus on school. And so I see that. And it's heartbreaking. And it's possible that other people see that same thing and their hearts are broken by it as well. And it's possible to be that person and to not believe Head Start works. It is. It is 100% possible. And it's possible at that point to say, I want there to be solutions. I just don't believe that's one of them. And you could say, well, it's only $8 billion a year. That's true. Relatively speaking to government spending, $8 billion isn't a lot of money. But the argument comes, and I want to read this. This isn't from some deep dive into research, because I just want to read this because it just shows you how available this information is. I just did a Wikipedia search to look up how people who talk about Head Start on Wikipedia talk about the effectiveness of it. And there's both sides. There are people that argue that it works well. They say there's statistical data that demonstrates that people who grew up in Head Start programs or early start programs that are funded or cooperatively funded with Head Start have less of have less of tendency for criminal record, to have a criminal record, are less likely to go to prison. All of these optimistic, they're more likely to be gainfully employed. They did better on test scores. All of these things are they say are demonstrated by certain studies. And there's another group that says there are short-term gains, which seems logical, right? When you focus on particular areas, they get better in those areas. But then as these kids progress, we see no measurable difference between them and the kids as far as academic performance that didn't go through Head Start. And this goes, by the way, to government close. So in 2011, we said Time magazine columnist Joe Klein called for the elimination of Head Start, citing an internal report that the program is costly and makes negligible impact on children's well-being over time. You take the million or so poorest 3 and 4 year old children and give them a leg up on socialization and education by providing preschool for them. If it works, it saves money in the long run by producing fewer criminals and welfare recipients. It is now 45 years later. 1965 is, by the way, when Head Start was begun. At the time he says this, 45 years later, we spend more than $7 billion providing Head Start to nearly 1 million children each year. And finally, there is indisputable evidence about the program's effectiveness provided by the Department of Health and Human Services. Head Start simply does not work. If you read that, he's saying there's ways that we can try to find to help them, but we're 45 years in this experiment and it's not working. And that's 60 years in the experiment now, and it's not working the way that we want it to. And I've said this elsewhere. We talk about Title 10 and when then President Trump was going after Title 10 and people were getting upset about it. And this has to do with medical funds that are being given in particular communities and how they're spent. And when they were tied up into abortion, they were restricted and people were saying you're withholding it. It's like, look, Title 10 is an old program. And if you look at the complaints from the communities that was meant to help, it's not working. It's not doing what it was intended to do. To say that Title 10 is not the answer is not to say I don't care. It's to say I care enough to want to do something that works, and I don't believe that works. Those are two entirely different things. So this idea that because a group of people may have similar goals in mind and desire to see the same ends that he wants to see, but don't believe the means by which he is going to provide those ends will work, makes them not pro-life, is so absurd and insulting, it's difficult to imagine we have to talk about it in an adult society. That we want to broad brush the people who disagree with us so disrespectfully. I don't agree with you. Maybe, I'm not saying, I'm just saying hypothetically, I don't agree that those programs are working the way they ought to, or at least it's worth a talk or consideration that there may be a better way to accomplish the goals that we want to accomplish. And then you have people who want to, Thomas Sowell, who would like to bring up into this conversation, when we had intact families, we didn't have the problems that we're having today. And Thomas Sowell would bring up that information and say, look, these are the things that changed, that created the problems in the communities that we come from, and they didn't exist prior to these other things happening. And that conversation will not be had because he's accused of being insensitive and all sorts of other horrible things. Now, that was somebody saying that it doesn't work. Here's the defense of it from a man by the name of W. Stephen Barnett, director of the National Institute for Early Education Research at Rutgers University. At the time that Klein wrote this in 2011, he rebutted it, saying, weighing all of the evidence and not just that cited by partisan on one side or the other, the most accurate conclusion is that Head Start produces modest benefits, including some long-term gains for children. Now, I just wanted to focus on Head Start. I didn't want to go through everything on that list, but I just wanted to use that as a demonstration of the point. The defender of Head Start, his defense when somebody said, let's seek to fund it because 45 years in this experiment, it's not working, was Head Start appears to produce modest gains in some long-term benefits. So are we really at the place where being willing to question the effectiveness of a government program that has existed for more than half a century and doesn't seem to be producing the results that anybody hoped for. That can't be what the people who started Head Start were hoping for when they started it. Hopefully we will do $8 billion a year, and 60 years into this, we'll be able to say, yes, we had some modest, possibly measurable gains. No. So there's no way that can be the basis on which condemning somebody as not being pro-life because they don't buy into that particular program. It's nonsense. And it's a distraction. Because even if I agreed with you on every single point that you just made, you're still going to fight for the right to abortion. I know I've stood in front of audiences and they bring things up and I say, okay, what if I conceded it all right now? What if I conceded every objection you have to every other position that I hold? What if I joined you right now in all of those things? What if I became an advocate for all of those things and I took it immediately to active advocacy? Would you then join me in calling abortion the act of destroying a human life prior to birth because 90% of the time, just because it's inconvenient? Would you now join me in condemning that if I accept your condemnation of me and agree to change? 100% of the time, the answer is no. It's not an argument. It's an ad hominem. You're a bad person. It's question begging. Every issue I care about is more important than the issue that you care about. And by virtue of me caring about these and you caring about that, I am pro-life. I have absolutely zero responsibility to demonstrate the urgency of anything that I listed versus the death of 1 million human lives every year to the practice of abortion. I just declare it so without evidence and condemn you for disagreement and being wrong. It is ad hominem, question-begging nonsense. And what's weird to me, for the side that constantly accuses us of hating women, is to watch them go online and cheer him on for screaming at this woman on his show. Way to go. You put her in her place. She'll never forget the day that you set her down like this. Facts. Truth. Go get her. Stupid woman thinking she had the right to talk about being pro-life in front of you. Man, you set her straight. Those woman haters. What craziness. What a weird world we live in, where a woman fighting for the value of human life and trying to articulate it gets screamed at by somebody. And then all the people who tell us all the time how much we hate women, this man yells at her and they cheer him on. And so that's just number one. There's an urgency to abortion because life is being lost. It's important. If you disagree with me about what the unborn are, it's important that we figure out what they are because they objectively are something. It's valuable that we spend time talking about it, engaging this issue. We have to determine whether or not this is the unjust destruction of innocent human beings or whether it's nothing. But we don't get to assume that it's nothing. And then we don't get to bury that assumption and a bunch of other assumptions about things that are more important than that and then condemn people for not agreeing with us across the board on those things when even if they did agree with us, we would never change our mind about abortion. Disingenuous, question-begging, ad hominem nonsense. It's an attack. It's not an argument. Okay. Now let's move on to the last thing that we're going to talk about today. And that is, I had planned to do and will do, as soon as we get done with the next 2 interviews, the next episode after the next 2 interviews. And I'm very excited about those. One will be with Tina Whittington from Students for Life of America. So we're going to talk about just a career that she's had of being immediate in her activism in her community and what it means. Because when I talked to her about it, she said, well, I'm not in apologetics. I know I am. I'm fine with that. I got that side covered. Your greatest value to me is that you're a successful person working in the pro-life world, fighting for the value of human life, and you're not me. So I want other people to hear what you're doing and what's important about the way that you guys do what you do, and really the importance of immediate action. That was one of the things I'm very excited about talking to her about, because she knows about this idea that when something happens, we have to be there immediately. And I'm not that way. I like something happens and I say, I'm going to need some time to mull this over. That's my response to this. So I'm fascinated by people who do good work and their immediate response is, we have to be there in person fighting this right now. Immediate action. So I'm going to be talking to Tina Whittington about that. And then after that, we're going to have Christopher Tollefson, a philosophy professor from University of South Carolina, who is the co-author of two books that I love. One of them is Embryo, that he wrote with the great Robert George, and the other is The Way of Medicine. And he has graciously agreed to come on, and we're going to focus on the way of medicine, and we're going to talk about that, which is looking at medical ethics in general. And then through that, we're going to get to embryo as well and talk a little bit about embryo. So that will be the second interview. So we're going to do Tina, we're going to do Dr. Tollefson, and then we're going to go back and we're going to do weird analogies. But today I wanted to talk about something else entirely because there was a debate online between on the podcast Whatever, and on the podcast Whatever, you had Kristen Hawkins from Students for Life America, you had Lila Rose from Live Action, and then you had this person who called themselves Destiny. And depending on who you're listening to, the debate went well or it went terribly for the pro-life side. I haven't watched it. It's 4 hours. I need to sit down and watch it. But because I am really interested in it. And I'm really interested, probably as much because so many people have varying opinions about how it went. Some people feel like Lila and Kristen did amazing, and other people feel like they left themselves open to some strong philosophical rebuttals. And then some people feel like there was just an ungraciousness that kind of settled. I don't know. I'm not here to speak about all this, but here's what was fascinating to me about it, was the bits of it that I have watched, and I have watched snippets from it. I say snippets because it's 4 hours from what I understand. So the little bit that I've watched are snippets. And in those snippets, Destiny, I think is what the person calls themselves. Yeah. They keep saying that the unborn are not persons. And so I want to talk about that for a second, a little bit more in depth, because they're not the only ones. He's not the only person saying it. This is something that comes up a lot. They're not persons. So what I found immediately when I listened to the justification that Destiny offered, the first thing that I thought as listening to them was, it's strange to me when we make this case, the case that the unborn are not person, human, but not person, how extraordinary this claim is. Now, let's give it the benefit. I always do my best to try to give people the benefit of the doubt and the best reasoning for why they would say the things that they're saying here. So let's do that. Okay. So if somebody says they're not persons, why are they saying that? Well, number one, we know that there's something that they want to do to that human life, right? And it may not just be abortion for the sake of convenience. It could be research. They want to use embryonic stem cells. They want to watch the early development of from zygote to the primitive streak forming in that first 12 to 14 days, and to see where cellular differentiation comes, but be free to destroy the life after they've used it for the resource that they wish to use it for. They may want to mine it for cures, for other things. There's all sorts of reasons. But what's happening is we're seeing biological human life and wanting to treat it in a way that we would not treat other human beings that we see and operate within on a daily basis, right? And so the justification comes when you talk to them. Why do you think this is okay? If that is biologically a human life, which is, by the way, the only reason it has any value for research at all. So we understand it's a biological human life, or a biological human life and your offspring that you want to destroy before they're born because you find their presence inconvenience. Why do you think it's okay? Here is, I think, the best possible explanation for where we get to this argument that there's such a thing as persons, because that's in the Constitution of the United States, rights are guaranteed to persons. That's why we're using the term persons, because we're trying to figure out who has rights and who doesn't. So the Constitution gives rights to persons, not to humans. Persons have rights. So we're like, why do you think then that we can differentiate between human beings and persons? It just seems to me that all human beings are persons, even though not all persons are human beings. All human beings are persons, that everybody in the human family should fall in the category of persons, and we should be approached accordingly. They were saying, no, here's the point. It's obvious to them that a zygote, single-celled organism, is not the same as you and me. You have rights. I have rights. They have rights. The zygote is not one of us. It's clearly not one of us. There are obvious differences between us. Same thing for an embryo. Same thing for a fetus. There's obviously differences between us. Rights are guaranteed to persons in the Constitution of the United States. That's not a person. And no reasonable human being, no rational human being can say that's a person. How could anybody look at a undifferentiated clump of cells with early development and say, that's the same as you and me? So we have to come to the conclusion then that it's possible to be a human life and to not be a person. And to them, that is so obvious. Now, it's obvious to them because they want to do something to that human life, because that's the only reason that we make that distinction at all. Because there are things that we want to do to that human life that we can't do to persons. And so we're going to say there is such a thing as a human being, and then there is such a thing as a person. All human beings are not persons. So here's the trick. How do we decide what that means to be a person? Because it is a wild claim. To me, it is a wild claim. To have someone stand in front of me and I have a conversation with them and I say, they tell me, look, they think that because their first point, your position is crazy, Jay. Your position is crazy because you expect me to accept the idea that this clump of cells has the same value that you and I have. And that they have the same rights that you and I have. And they get to all these different confusions about it. Like they'll say, oh, we're going to give them a social security card, or we're going to let them, which is nonsense, right? I have no problem with graduated governmental rights. I have no problem with you not being able to drink until you're a certain age, drive till you're a certain age, own a gun until a certain age. All of these things I get, and I understand why we have not be able to rent a car till you're a certain age. So if we're going to say, there's no reason to say that we have to give them social security numbers the second they come into existence. I'm fine with waiting till they're born, just like I'm fine on waiting till you're 18 to be able to vote, 16 to be able to drive, 21 to be able to drink, although I feel differently about that one probably. But I mean, there's things that I'm okay with the concept of graduation to certain rights based on your maturing in society. But that's not the kind of rights we're talking about here. We're just talking about the basic right to exist and to not be destroyed. So when you say Jay, they're obviously different. You're crazy if you don't see the differences. Well, I'm not as crazy as you think I am, but I understand why you think I'm crazy. But I do think that their human life, their whole and distinct human life from the moment they come into existence, and they have the same basic rights and we have the same basic duty and responsibilities we have to any other human being, not the least of which is just to not kill them. That's all I'm asking us to do. Refrain from destroying human life unless it's absolutely necessary. That's the request that I'm making. Not to treat them like a toddler when they're a fetus, not to treat a fetus or not to treat them like a 10-year-old when they're an embryo. Because I know that embryos are not 10-year-olds. But I know that a human embryo and a human 10-year-old are the same thing at different stages of development. And so when they say, Jay, you're crazy because you think they're all the same, and they're obviously different. And so from that, they extract this idea that they are persons, we are persons, you and I are persons, and they are not persons. They are merely human. Hence the name of our organization. Merely Human Ministries. Merely humans have the same rights that all human beings should have. So here's the problem. when you flip it around and you say, okay, what you're saying is that every human being comes into existence, lives their life, and then dies. And during that, they are two radically different things. And sometimes they're both of those things at the same time. They are a biological animal, a human, and they are a person, this magical rights-bearing entity to which I owe duty and responsibility. I have accountability for the ways that I treat them, and they are to be recognized under the law. So we have a continuum of human life, and you're saying we can draw lines in there and say there are some people in human life that matter and some don't. And those people that matter, we confer upon them the title of person, and those humans that don't matter, they're merely human. What makes that difference? So we're going to talk today a little bit about Mary Ann Warren's requirements for personhood. Mary Ann Warren, a philosopher, a pro-choice philosopher, gave us her 5 requirements for personhood. Persons have consciousness of objects and events, external and or internal to themselves, in particular, the capacity to feel pain. That's 1. We have consciousness of objects and events, external and or internal to ourselves, in particular, our capacity to feel pain. We can feel pain and we're aware that we're feeling pain. Number 2, persons can reason. They have the developed capacity to solve new and relatively complex problems. All right. 3, persons have self-motivated activity which is relatively independent of either genetic or direct external control. I can decide what I want to do next. 4, persons possess the capacity to communicate by whatever means messages of an indefinite variety of types that is not just with indefinite number of possible contents, but indefinitely many topics. So I can communicate with people through multiple different means. Persons have the presence of self-concepts and self-awareness, either individual or racial or both. So Mary Ann Warren says you don't have to have all 5 of those, but if you have none of those, then you're not a person. Now that list is hard. I mean, in the sense of if you want to go through that list, you're going to find out that it does more than justify abortion. It justifies infanticide. It justifies killing the severely disabled. It justifies killing a lot of human beings. It takes a lot of people in the human family and scooches them out of personhood. So yeah, you don't meet requirements. But even then, some of them are just flat out arguable. And I want to talk about some of that. Persons have consciousness of objects and events external and or internal to themselves, in particular, the capacity to feel pain. If there's anything that we are worse at, it's determining when somebody else can feel pain and what the level of pain they feel or experience is. And so there was years I've read in multiple different sources where we didn't believe that newborns felt pain. So when we did particular medical procedures on newborns, we did not give them anything to help with the pain. And then we found out later, as we advanced in our understanding of the nervous system of newborns, that not only do they actually experience pain, they appear to experience it more acutely than adults. Meaning whatever you do to them that would hurt me and you hurts them worse. And so essentially, through the best advice of medical professionals over a long period of time, we were torturing newborns during medical procedures. Solid. Now I say this because when I say we don't understand how other people feel pain, because pain is a first-person experience. As a redhead, I have been given to understand through some of the research that I've read that I experience pain differently than a brunette would. With somebody with a different melanin count in their skin, different color eyes, different color hair, all of that, they're going to experience pain a little differently than I'll experience it. That's why when you go to the doctor's office, they have that weird pain chart, because it is so hard to understand the level of pain that you're feeling at any given moment. We have to have this weird series of smiley faces to frowny faces and say, can you tell us which one of these frowny faces or smiley faces you are right now? Could you point to the one that best explains your pain level at the moment? And, if you point at the end there, it's just the worst level of pain, like that really sad, angry, upset looking smiley face. That's to indicate that this is the worst ever. I think Brian Regan has a great routine where he talks about when he was going through some level of pain, and when they asked him what level of pain he was, he said an 8. He said largely because he heard that if you break your femur, that's the worst pain that you can go under. And so he didn't want to insult the people that broke their femurs by saying he was a 10, even though he felt like he probably was maxed out on pain. I can tell you, I have had several different things in my life that were incredibly painful. And I remember, my wife will tell you, the first time I had a kidney stone, when I didn't know what was going on and I was trying to figure out what was happening, I told her, I don't know what's happening to me. I feel like I've maxed out on the level of pain that I can endure right now. That's what I told her. If anyone could tell me that it wasn't going to get worse than what I'm going through right now, I think I can ride this out until whatever's happening to me is over. But if it gets even a fraction worse than what I'm enduring right now, then I need help. And so I realized at that moment, as I was dealing with all of this pain, that I had reached my maximum ability to deal with pain without answers. If I could have answers, I could deal with the pain more. But if the pain went like one click farther than it was, I was going to need some medical professional to explain to me both what was wrong with me and how we were going to stop this from hurting. So pain is very subjective. It's very first person. And we're terrible about being able to determine when someone else is in pain and what's hurting them. So to plant the first requirement to be a person, as that persons have consciousness of objects and events external and internal to them, so in particular the capacity to feel pain, is already problematic from the beginning, because you're grounding this idea of recognizing the right of another being to exist and my ability to measure whether or not you're sensing and experiencing pain. And it's one of the worst things we do in the world. So already we're in trouble. Let's go to number 2. Persons can reason. They have the developed capacity to solve new and relatively complex problems. Okay. You can't satisfy this for a very long time after you're born. This requirement automatically excludes, I want to say, I can't remember if you've ever heard of the dot test, where the mirror test. What they do, they're trying to determine whether or not you're aware of yourself. And this goes to presence of self-concept, number 5 too, self-concept, self-awareness, individual, racial, or both. Let's get jumping to 5 too. And we're talking about 2 and 5 kind of at the same time. But I wanted to talk about the mirror test for a second. They put children in front of a mirror and they put a dot in the middle of their forehead. And then they're trying to determine whether or not you can look into a mirror and recognize what you're looking at is you, which gives some indication that we have crossed over into a place of self-concept and self-awareness, that I realize I am a thing. And when I'm looking at myself in the mirror, I see that's me. So they put this dot on the forehead and they put kids in front of the mirror, and the kids look at themselves in the mirror. And for a long time, I want to say up to like 18 months, and somewhere in that, I mean, it's a long time after they're born, 10 to 18 months or something like that, they look in the mirror and they just do nothing. And then all of a sudden, one day, they cross a threshold and you put them in front of the mirror and they look at themselves in the mirror and they do this. They rub their forehead, because they look in the mirror and they say, hey, that's me. And I got something on my forehead. And they start trying to rub it off to figure out what it is. So the reasoning behind the mirror test is that prior to them recognizing that dot is on their head and trying to rub it off, then when they look in the mirror, they're not seeing themselves, because they're not aware they are a thing in that sense. They don't have that level of self-awareness. That the second they get that, they look in the mirror, they see the dot in their head, and they try to rub it off. And the problem is this developed capacity to even understand what you are, and then going back to 2, the ability to reason. To reason and develop, solve new and relatively complex problems. Man, I know adults that cannot solve relatively complex problems. I watch them all the time struggling with technology around me. I don't know how to make this work. I don't know what to do. There are some of you put technology in front of them and like, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to make it work. Like this thing was designed to be user friendly. It is essentially idiot proof. It was built by people who know that the people using it don't have the slightest idea how it works. And so they've made it as easy as possible for you to navigate its operating system. And still you hold it and start banging it against the table because you don't know what to do with it. Solving complex problems. Are you kidding me? So even 2 and 5, these are things that don't come till way later in development. So we just put all sorts of young life at risk to be destroyed. Number 3, persons have self-motivated activity which is relatively independent or either genetic or direct or external control. And I know people who deny this exists at all. Perfectly rational, reasonable adults who don't believe in this idea of self-motivated, independent decision-making at all. We have no self-motivated activity. They think we are deterministic by our very nature, that everything that's happening to us is just atoms colliding with these atoms, and I'm not making decisions. There's only illusion of myself and the only illusion of my mind, and that what's actually happening is that there's a physical event that causes a physical side effect and a cause and effect. Physical cause, physical effect. Physical cause, physical effect. And they call this event causation, right? It's just a series of events happening. They just keep happening. And as a result of physical things happening, atoms collide with atoms and something else happens. And I'm never motivating any activity in any real sense. So there's a whole worldview that denies this exists at all. For it to be the measurement of you being a person so that we can destroy you if you lack it is absurd. It's obviously difficult. But the problem is it comes much earlier. I would argue that it comes much earlier than she thinks it does. Self-motivated activity seems to me to be pretty basic. And what I mean by that is we have evidence. First of all, we have evidence of the interaction. Christopher Kaiser talks about this in chapter 3 of his third edition of the Ethics of Abortion. He talks about the idea that there's evidence of twins interacting and triplets, or anybody that shares a sac acting, particularly twins, they're acting in a self-motivated activity, which is independent of the genetics. They're just deciding to do things. They enjoy relating with their twin. So they'll reach out and touch each other and not in a reflexive way. It's not like something happens like, hey, and grab a hold of them. But it seems to be a pattern that they enjoy the company of their twin. And they do things to demonstrate that to each other inside the mother. Now, I got anecdotal evidence of this. My wife will tell you that our first 2 kids were 2 entirely different kids. She said that if she got into a position that bothered Peyton would bang on inside of her for a second to express his displeasure with where she was sitting, and then he would stop. And she said MJ was different. MJ would hit until she moved. She got into a situation that she didn't like, and MJ hit and 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 just kept hitting until my wife moved. So there you have self-motivated activity. And I would tell you, by the way, that that description of them is consistent to today when they're 20 years old and 18 years old. That those 2 personality holds to the way they are as human beings. Now they're more mature. Another thing, responding self-motivated activity. Peyton, I could press on parts of my wife's stomach when she was pregnant, and he would press back. And I could move around, and if I pressed different parts, he would press against the different parts. He would find where I was pressing, and he would push back, whether his feet or his hands. It's a little weird because you could actually see his hand go and push back out, and he would move his feet and he would move around, but he was responding to things that we were doing. It wasn't, there's no indication it was reflexive light. It was a game that he would play and he would push it. And they also respond to different things. This also forms to 4, right? Persons possess a capacity to communicate by whatever means. Messages of an indefinite variety of types. Well, we could argue that this type of active by unborn in my wife was indicative of communication. Mary Jackson was trying to tell her, I'm sick of where you're sitting. It's squishing me weird right now. Move. And that's a basic rudimentary form of communication. So in the ones that it's not possible for the unborn to meet, it's also not possible for the newborns to meet. And the meeting those criteria come very late. And the others where she's assuming that the unborn don't meet them, we seem to have evidence that they may in fact do. And now becomes a line of definition of how do we define the criteria that she's giving? Because what does she mean by communicate? Does my son hitting my wife or my daughter hitting my wife until she moves count as communication? There's evidence I've seen of people saying they respond to light and that you can move light around and they'll respond to that light movement. They clearly know their mother's voices differently than the other voices. There's a relationship that they have to music. I know people that said they play certain music and their unborn kid would go nuts. And it was very specific for this one. It was very drum-based, percussion-based music. They went nuts when you played that percussion. So it's not clear. It's either not clear that the unborn don't meet this criteria, or they're not capable of meeting that criteria. So by definition, you are just giving them requirements they can never meet. On any case, it's not clear that these are successful delineations between the human family so that I'm free to kill somebody else. Some of them they're too arbitrarily chosen. I mean, who gave Marianne Warren the ability to be able to define what it means to be a person such that if I destroy you and you're not a person, I've done nothing wrong? Who authorized her to divide the human family in that way? And who gave her the wisdom to come up with the correct criteria when every single thing on that list has problems? Every single item on the list that we just gave has problems. She's not the only one. I just wanted to use her because I think she's got the best attempt at giving us criteria to follow that says that we should be able to kill non-personal human life. We have no duty or obligation to it. By the way, even though it is impossible for a newborn to meet this criteria, Marianne Warren does not believe infanticide should be morally okay. Now, Michael Tooley does, Peter Singer does, Marianne Warren does not. Her defense of why, though, Christopher Kaiser, again, going back to chapter 3 of the Ethics of Abortion, he points out that her defense of why we shouldn't be able to kill newborns, why infanticide is wrong, doesn't match up with her defense of why newborns, or why the unborn should be killed, or we should be free to kill them. So the same criteria can be judged on each one of them. And it's very ad hoc the way she tries to get out of it. At the end of the day, she's just deeply uncomfortable with the idea of infanticide. Good for her, by the way. Good for being uncomfortable with the idea of infanticide, so that even when your own arguments seem to be leading us all to the idea that infanticide should be okay, at least you say, I like my arguments all the way up to the point that they say we should be able to kill newborns, but then I don't like them. So we're going to find some other criteria to come in that says that we shouldn't be able to kill newborns. Good for you, right? I mean, you're still sensitive on that issue, and you're not like Tooley or Singer, who have gone the other way and saying, yeah, I agree. The end result of my saying rational capacities, or where we should ground the value of human beings, means that newborns have no value, less value than certain fish out there. And so we should be able to do with them whatever we wish. So that's a problem that I think that we give too much when people argue and we try to meet them on those terms. I think that we should first point out, you try to make it sound like I'm crazy for thinking that very early human life ought to be given basic dignity and respect, and minimally we shouldn't kill them, as if I don't understand that an embryo and an infant are two different things. I understand that they're two different distinct development stages of human life. I really do. I'm not confused about what fetuses can do and what they can't do. I'm not confused about what an embryo can or can't do. All I'm saying is that they're not required to do anything for you to be forced to refrain from killing them. That seems pretty basic to me. And when you say, no, we can kill them because there's such a thing as persons and humans, to me, you're the one that's made this extraordinary leap. This born out of your desire to do ill to another human life. And that you have no reason for being able to give me that I should believe that you're right, other than this list of criteria that were provided here that they can't possibly meet, or they can, and you just won't define it in such a way that they do meet that criteria. By the way, like I said, we can make a case that they meet some of those. And if they meet some of those by Marianne Warren's definition, then they are persons. And then she'd go back and say, well, certainly an embryo can't meet those. She's right. I mean, that would be absolutely correct. right? I mean, early embryo cannot meet the requirements that we've been laid out for being a person. I just don't believe they have any responsibility or duty to do that. And that gets into a whole different thing, because by the time we're destroying life through the practice of abortion, they're not early embryos. They're not an undifferentiated mass. That goes into research. That goes into other areas where we can get early life and use it as a resource. That has nothing to do with abortion. We're not performing abortions that early. We could get sidetracked into a discussion of oral contraceptives or things like that. But that's a different discussion for a different day. For the most part, when you're talking about the act of abortion as it's practiced by most people, the thing that is being destroyed is not an undifferentiated cell, a clump of cells. It has already started to develop human-looking characteristics. But why do they look human? Because they are human. Because even when they're embryo and they don't have those human characteristics, they're coming. They're on their way. So the idea that we should be able to interrupt their lifespan or interrupt their life because we have found them inconvenient and we were able to define them out of meaningful existence, to me is weird. I understand that to them, the idea that I think you owe an embryo or a zygote the basic respect to refrain from killing it is weird to them, because they don't look at it and say that can't possibly be human in the same way that you and I are. They say, well, it doesn't have the same capacities that we have, but it will. You know when it will? When it matures a little bit. Do you know why it won't mature? Because we kill it. That doesn't seem fair. It is a human. It is going to go through the human developmental process. And for me to accept the argument that I should be free to kill it because you have declared it a non-personal human life, that is an extraordinary step that has to be reviewed. They don't get to just say, well, they're not persons. They're obviously not persons. They're clearly not persons. And we all know persons have rights. Sure. But when I say persons have rights, I mean humans have rights. That's what I mean. And when you say persons have rights, and that's what I think, by the way, is the best and most inclusive and ultimately most protective of all human beings in society way to understand what the Constitution is saying when it's talking about persons and rights. That we should expand. That we're always at our best when we're expanding our neighborhood. When we talk about love our neighbor, we're always at our best when we're expanding all men created equal to a larger class of peoples. When the more inclusive we are, the better the world is going to be. And the more we're going to be forced to find creative solutions to the problems that we face, the more that we allow ourselves the luxury of defining other human beings out of meaningful existence, saying they're non-personal, they're not one of us, the more we put all sorts of people at risk, not just the unborn life that we want to destroy, but the severely disabled, the elderly, newborns, that may be injured unexpectedly or may show signs of a genetic disorder that we didn't catch early on. If we want a society that's inclusive and accepting, then we have to have a broad view of what it means to be a human being. Once we give ourselves the ability to say there's such a thing as a non-personal human, and I'm allowed to destroy that thing, then we just open up a whole world of bad that we're going to have to sort through. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. I think that that's an extraordinary claim, but I wanted to give Marianne Warren's requirements for personhoods a moment to talk about it, because she did her best to give us a working definition of what it means to be a person that's more comprehensive than just hanging on one single thing. And what she has done is give us a list that I think Christopher Kaiser and others philosopher Christopher Kaiser and others have said, put our humanity, our full humanity, our personhood at risk of being episodic during our life. Our dignity, our humanity, our personhood is something we either have or we don't. But when we tie it to things that we have in grades and things that come and go at different levels during the course of our life, we put ourselves in a very strange situation to decide who we owe obligations and duties to and who we don't, and when we're valuable and when we're not. So in short, Marianne Warren's requirements were persons are conscious, particularly the ability to feel pain. Persons can reason. They have the developed capacity to solve new and relatively complex problems. Persons have self-motivated activity which is relatively independent of either genetic or direct external control. Persons possess the capacity to communicate by whatever means or messages of an indefinite variety of types. Persons have presence of self-concept, self-awareness. That's what you have to have, some of that to be a person. And I just reject the idea that we can divide human beings up cleanly from persons and non-persons. I reject the idea that we have the authority to do that, especially when the end of that authority that we seek is the ability to destroy other human beings without apology and without reason, as a resource or as an inconvenience. I reject the idea that anyone could ever come up with a list, because as just a cursory look at that list, we saw that there are problems with it. That it either defines too many people out of meaningful existence, or it doesn't, or it's not defining the group that it thinks it is defining out of existence. But either way, it's just a list that's not clean. It's not clean enough to be able to divide the human family up and say, okay, I get it now. I get it. Okay, so yes, we can kill them. I get it. It's clear, crystal clear. We can kill them. So on the next one, before we talk to Tina Whittington, we're going to talk about birth as a bright line of an indicator. So we're going to continue the conversation a little bit about person. We're going to get into a very particular, as opposed to the list of things that Marianne Warren gave us, we're going to address the people who say, okay, birth is a clear line. It's a clear moment where we can say, from this point on, it is a person because it was born. And they have reasons for believing that. So we're going to look at those reasons on the next episode before we have Tina Whittington on. But that brings us to the conclusion of today. And as always, I thank everybody that's listening. If you're enjoying the content, please visit us at merelyhumanministries.org, and you can donate to our effort there. If you are, and people are doing it, and we're grateful for it. I thank everybody that's a part of this, particularly the excitement over, I have people contact me and tell me the excitement over the interviews. Some of the people that are agreeing to interview. That has been the exciting thing for me, is how many people that I really want to talk to about the work they're producing have been so gracious and generous with their time. And so I'm looking forward to the interviews we have coming up, and even more people who we're trying to book right now who we're arguing over days. I won't announce them until we have them booked. But this has been a fun project for everybody working on it. And we hope that you continue to tune in. I hope that you share it with friends so they have the opportunity to hear, share it with others so that they can hear what we're doing. Look to the website, merelyhumanministries.org. We are breaking out the interviews from season 1, and we're putting them there as a standalone. So if you want to go back and listen to the interview, but not the whole podcast, you have the freedom to do that. We're going to start putting other shorter snippets from the interviews up as well. So this is Jay Watts from Merely Human Ministries. This has been the Human Things Podcast, Season 2, Episode 4. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.